Thanks for tuning into the Dinosaurs Lately podcast, a dinosaur podcast that features periodic updates recapping the latest news on the dinosaurs. My name's Ryan Rogers, and this is the podcast that targets a type of dinosaur and tries to catch you up on everything that's been published on them lately.
Maybe I ain't been doing like I should. Baby, these days I do feel.
This is episode 3 of these interstitial episodes I've created to keep up with all the dinosaur news, even while I'm not publishing new episodes of the Jurassic Park cast. I hope you feel up to date. Welcome to episode 3, Macronarians. I recorded August 7th, 2025. A continued thank you to Christoph Oakes of Snail, S-N-A-L-E, and you can check out his incredible albums on Spotify and Bandcamp, and today's intro is Maybe Days from the album Charlemagne, and the outro is Atom Age Vampire Cat in the Brain from Snail's self-titled debut album, Snail. This episode, we're catching up on Macronarians, so that we're all on the same page. The Macronarians are a type of sauropod famous for being totally huge and having long necks. Specifically, Macronarians are named after having a large, hence macro, nose hole in their skull, where their naria, which is the word for like nose or nasal hole, so it's Macronarian. They have a big hole, nose hole. How big is this hole? The diameter of their nasal opening exceeds the size of their eye openings. Their forelimbs are relatively long compared to their hind limbs, like brachiosaurs. You can envision the arm lizard, and they have a wide-gauged posture. These types of sauropods ranged in age from the late Jurassic to the late Cretaceous and are known from all over the globe. Specifically, the Macronarians include all chimerasauromorphs, which are sauropods built like Chimerasaurus, and titanosaurs, which is the only cladosauropods which survived into the late Cretaceous. In this episode, though, I don't have any news on chimerasaurs, just titanosaurs, but you'll get the picture. Titanosaurs, named after their titanic size, are consistently considered to be the dominant modelers of global paleo ecosystems, at least during the major parts of the late Cretaceous. As they came to dominate, titanosaurs underwent a period of wide dispersion and diversifications, becoming the dominant megaherbivorous sauropod in terrestrial ecosystems until the end of the Cretaceous. Titanosaurs are the largest land animals known. They had small heads compared to other sauropods, though somewhat more elongated. Their nostrils were large, and all had crests formed by the nasal bones. Their teeth were somewhat spatulate, which I think means that they were spoon-like, or like pegs and pencils, and they were very small teeth. Their necks were of average sauropod length, and their tails were whip-like, though less so than diplodocids, and they had a wider pectoral area, providing a wide-legged stance. They had stocky forelimbs that were longer than the hind limbs, and some titanosaurs had no digits on their hands. I just walked in like these horseshoe-shaped stumps for feet. And some had relatively flexible spinal columns, suggesting they may have been able to rear up on their hind legs. Some had armored skin. I guess they would look like beads. These would be like harder scales that surrounded their backs and things like that. So that's interesting. So we have some new species. With that image of a titanosaur in mind, here are some new species out of South America that have been named lately. The first paper comes from the Zoological Journal of the Linnean Society, named New Sauropod Species from Northwestern Brazil, Biomechanics and the Radiation of Titanosauria, published on December 2024. They name a new titanosaur Tiamat valdecii, the first dinosaur species described from the Potiguar Basin, filling a crucial gap in the early stages of the titanosaurian radiation around the world. In other words, there were fewer titanosaurs known from the early Cretaceous in Brazil, and so finding a basal early diverging member of the species in an early Cretaceous rock formation helps with the larger macro-paleoecological questions about titanosaur dispersals and macroevolution. That said, this big guy is only known from a couple tail vertebrae, which have unique diagnostic characteristics. The phylogenetic analysis machine placed Tiamat as a basal species of titanosaur, and the first nominal dinosaur species from the Acta Formation. Quote, the presence of Tiamat valdecii at the Acta Formation enhances the knowledge of the dinosaur diversity of this formation and supports a more widespread diversification of titanosaurs during the early Cretaceous of Brazil. The presence of titanosaurs and rebbachisaurid at the Acta Formation supports hypotheses about the long-term coexistence between these two groups in some localities. The authors say this, quote, in turn further supports the possibilities of niche partitioning and a non-competitive relationship between those two groups throughout the Cretaceous period. The discovery of Tiamat valdecii elucidates part of the first titanosaur radiation, and future works with more complete specimens from the same region may help our further understanding of this process. The Acta Formation is in the Ceará province of Brazil, which will be familiar to Jurassic Park fans because this is where the terrific pterosaur from the aviary Pterodactylus gets its name from, the Ceará province of Brazil. The second article is also about caudal titanosaur vertebrae from Brazil, but this time they didn't name a new species with them. They published on them all the same, though, because the, quote, newly described specimens play a pivotal role in, quote, elucidating faunal gaps in the Brazilian Cretaceous. The caudal elements with paleopathologies document the third known case of subchondral cysts in caudal vertebrae of dinosaurs, highlighting the rarity of such cysts in the fossil record, particularly among sauropod dinosaurs. Lastly, the Pedra Grande specimens underscore the vast potential of Mato Grosso State in uncovering more complete specimens, further enriching our understanding of dinosaur diversity and paleobiology in this region. The article, New Lithostrotian Specimens from the Mato Grosso State and Comments about Tail Injuries in Sauropod Dinosaurs, was published February 2025 in the Journal of South American Earth Sciences. The specimens are housed at the Museu de Ciências da Terra in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and comprise 4 incomplete caudal vertebrae and 2 portions of appendicular bones, including a probable fragmentary left ilium, which cannot be assigned to the same individual. Comparisons with more complete taxa allow the authors to identify this material as representative of 2 distinct morphotypes, both exhibiting a combination of primitive and derived morphological features. Additionally, the 2 caudal elements of morphotype 1 present some pathological features, such as subchondral cysts, being the third case of this paleopathology reported in titanosaurians. What are subchondral cysts? They are fluid-filled sacs or lesions that form in the bone just beneath the cartilage of a joint, often associated with osteoarthritis. So this is evidence that the tail had pain and stiffness in its tail thanks to swelling in its joints, which resulted in lesions or swelling in its bones too. The authors sum their article by speaking to the potential the site holds for the future. Quote, despite being fragmentary and lacking diagnostic features at the genus level, these new specimens demonstrate that Mato Grosso State holds great potential for the discovery of more material that can contribute to titanosaurian paleobiology. The third article comes from the Acta Palaeontologica Polonica, published way back in 2023, named A New Gigantic Titanosaurian Sauropod from the Early Late Cretaceous of Patagonia. Partial skeletons of at least 4 individuals were found together, and the authors have described part of the lower jaw, several vertebrae, and most of the limb bones. They named the species Bustangori Titan Shiva, in honor of the property owner Manuel Bustangori, and Shiva, a supreme deity who destroys and transforms the universe, making this Bustangori's titanic supreme deity of destruction and transformation, which refers to the huge Titanosaur's generic impact on the environment, as it was truly immense. It's estimated to have had a body mass of 67 tons. It's found in the Neuquén Formation, dated to somewhere around the Cenomanian age of the early Late Cretaceous period. The authors say, quote, the record of this new sauropod corroborates the idea that gigantism, the evolution of forms over 50 metric tons, would have evolved many times within Titanosauria. Quote, gigantic titanosaurs were an important component of the Cretaceous dinosaur faunas of Patagonia, at least for almost 50 million years. The finding of Bustangori Titan Shiva increases our knowledge of these extraordinary animals not only in terms of their anatomical diversity, but also their evolutionary history. Its phylogenetic recovery as a lithostrotian titanosaur supports the coexistence of at least 2 lineages of gigantic titanosaurs, the saltosauroids and the logincosaurs, both within North Patagonia at the same time. Quote, the early Late Cretaceous is a particularly important time for the evolutionary history of sauropods, both globally and regionally. Particularly, the time represented by the base of the Neuquén Formation, which is in the late Cenomanian, is relevant for its diversity of sauropods, mid to large-sized titanosaurs, small to medium-sized basal diplodocoids, and gigantic titanosaurs. Among these sauropods, the differences in body size and tooth shape suggest that they coexisted through niche partitioning, or rather, their diets and behaviors weren't in direct competition. They stuck to their own niches, in other words. This particular moment in the Neuquén Formation marks a period at the Cenomanian-Turonian boundary where evidence suggests there was a global faunal turnover which marked the extinction of basal diplodocoids and certain lineages of titanosaurs as well as other dinosaur groups, and the survivors were some saltosauroids and logincosaur lineages who lasted, quote, until practically the end of the Cretaceous. The next new titanosaur from South America was named in 2023 in the journal Cretaceous Research in the paper A Rebbachisaurid-Mimicking Titanosaur and Evidence of a Late Cretaceous Faunal Disturbance Event in South-West Gondwana. This titanosaur was uncovered from the Bajo de la Carpa Formation, also Neuquén, Argentina, but in a Santonian-aged rock formation that's around 10 million years younger than the Bustangori Titan, notably after the aforementioned faunal turnover that ended the diplodocoids in the area. So, What's this titanosaur like? Well, recall how diplodocoid sauropods were replaced by titanosaurs in the late Cretaceous? This new species suggests that titanosaurs evolved to enter into the vacated niche of the diplodocoids called rebbachisaurid. Quote, among sauropod dinosaurs proposed as low browsers, 3 distinctive anatomical traits appear to be present. A short and subhorizontal neck perpendicularly positioned concerning the ground, a broad symphysial surface of the snout with teeth restricted to the anterior margin, and slender teeth. With these adaptations, diplodocoids, quote, can be considered as the classic low-level browsers, with diplodocids and dicraeosaurids as an abundant component of large herbivorous fauna during the late Jurassic across North America, Europe, and Gondwana, and also during the early Cretaceous in western Gondwana, say the authors. The rebbachisaurid represented the diplodocids in the Cretaceous sauropod fauna of South America, Africa, and Europe until Cenomanian-Turonian times, they add. The diplodocoid extinction, quote, may have facilitated the expansion and diversification of derived titanosaurians, they add. Quote, here we provide a preliminary description of a largely complete new titanosaurian sauropod specimen which shows remarkable convergent traits of its skull anatomy with rebbachisaurid sauropods, and through cladistic analyses, the new taxon is recovered within a clade of derived titanosaurs, some of which share, quote, these low-browsing adaptations. The very low and wide anatomy of this dinosaur's skull, with teeth restricted to the tip of a squared-off snout, along with its relatively short neck, considering it was a sauropod after all, are all likely adaptations for low-level browsing. For these reasons, the dinosaur named Inawentu oslatus, which means imitator with a broad mouth, suggesting that this titanosaur evolved to imitate the low-browsing characteristics of recently extinct rebbachisaurid of the late Cretaceous Gondwana. The next article is from the Morphomuseum from December 2024, which features the article Digital Reconstruction of the Skull of Sarmientosaurus musachioi, a titanosaur from the Upper Cretaceous of Argentina. The authors say that despite titanosaurs being the most abundant sauropod record from the Cretaceous period worldwide, with over 50 species discovered in South America alone, the records are, quote, predominantly limited to post-cranial remains. Quote, although numerous cranial fragments have been found globally, only 5 species have preserved skulls complete enough to yield paleobiological insights: Nemegnosaurus, Rapidosaurus, Topauisaurus, and Sarmientosaurus, and most recently, Diamantosaurus. This new paper provides a digital restoration of Sarmientosaurus, a late Cretaceous titanosaur from the Barro-Barrial Formation in Argentina, and the authors hope, quote, this digital restoration provides a valuable tool for future biomechanical analyses, with potential to offer new information into the feeding strategies, skull mechanics, and overall physiology of titanosaurs. Sarmientosaurus was first described in 1997. The Barro-Barrial Formation is from the Cenomanian age, making this the very earliest of the late Cretaceous, before the titanosaurs overran the southern hemisphere. This is, as of its publishing, quote, the only titanosaur skull specimen freely accessible as a high-resolution 3D model to the broader scientific community. The final new South American titanosaurus Chaetatitan calvoi, named in the 2024 paper New Fossiliferous Locality from the Anacleto Formation from northern Patagonia, with the description of a new titanosaur from the journal Revista del Museo Argentino de Ciencias Naturales. This site is a new, quote, fossil invertebrate assemblage from a previously unknown locality of the Anacleto Formation in the Rio Negro province, Argentina, and they report finding a type of abelosaurid and this rhynchosaurian titanosaur, Chaetatitan. The name uses the Mapudungun word Chad, which means salt, and Titan, meaning giant, and the Calvoi honors Jorge O. Calvo, making this Calvo's salt giant. Jorge Calvo coined the term Rhynkosauria and passed away in 2023, so the timing was good for this. The new titanosaur indicates that rhynchosaurians were characterized by a body shape that was different from other titanosaurs, with brachiosaur-like posture, gracile limbs, and protonic tail. These are lightly built, small-sized titanosaurs, all being less than 36 feet long, with straight limbs and a strongly modified pelvic girdle. In the Campanian age, this is much later Cretaceous than the earlier named species, and as you can hear from its much different appearance, it's a much more highly derived titanosaur that's further developing into the various niches that they will fill by the end of the Mesozoic. Sliding out of South America, new species have been named from Asia as well. In the article, a new titanosaurian sauropod, Gandititan cavocaudatus, from the Late Cretaceous of southern China. Published in the Journal of Systematic Paleontology in January 2024, the new discovery is helping put in focus the evolutionary tale of titanosaurs in eastern Asia. Quote, Titanosaur forms are well represented in the Cretaceous of eastern Asia. Even brachiosaurids, a group otherwise known only from North America, Africa, and Europe, may be present in the mid-Cretaceous of China, given the Yangtze Basin material. The oldest known unequivocal Somphospondyli are from the early Cretaceous of Asia and South America, and this group may have originated in late Jurassic. Somphospondyli are those sauropods which are considered to be derived from the brachiosaur-like late Jurassic sauropods, but departing from that bowel plan towards Titanosauria. Or, these sauropods are when brachiosaurs split off, leading to the origins of Titanosauria. Most Cretaceous sauropods from China are Somphospondyli, the authors note. The holotype JXGMFV1, housed at the Zhangji Geological Museum, was uncovered from the Neuquén Formation. It's comprised of 6 cervical vertebrae, 2 partial dorsal vertebrae, and a complete sacrum with 17 caudal vertebrae and part of the right pelvis. No trace of neurocentral sutures is visible, suggesting that the JXGMFV1 was a subadult or adult at the time of its death. The name is an amalgam of lots of influences in the genus name Gan. That refers to the fact that the fossil is from Ganzhou City, while Di is the Chinese pinyin word for the earth and is also the first syllable of DZ, meaning geology. So Gandhi is thus an abbreviated form using to honor geological work in Ganzhou City, and Titan is a suffix commonly used in generic names of sauropods. And the species name is from the Latin cavum, which is cavity, and cauda, which is tail. And the intended meaning is the cavity-tailed refers to the complicated pattern of pleural cells and neural arch laminae seen in the anterior caudal vertebrae of the fossils here. The authors also note there is some further connectivity with the name that they've picked and the dinosaur. Quote, we also note the incidental similarity between the first syllable of Gandititan and the Old Norse word Gandra, referring to the magic or magical spirit, which is perhaps appropriate given the immense size and fantastical appearance of titanosaurian and sauropod dinosaurs. So Gandititan doesn't refer to Gandhi in any way. A bunch of other things, yes, but not Gandhi, but it's Gandititan. Gandititan's fossils were collected from the Neuquén Formation, which is interpreted as being in the early late Cretaceous ages around the Cenomanian-Turnerian, which is before the Diplodocus extinction to come. The remains are fairly well preserved, and the authors believe it may have been up to 46 feet in length, and most closely related to other Asian titanosaurs, which isn't surprising. The remains of titanosaurs, and many dinosaurs, frankly, are often sparse and incomplete, but those of Gandititan are advantageously plentiful, which makes it comparable to other titanosaurs whose remains are incomplete. Quote, as many as 26 titanosaur forms have been reported from the Cretaceous of China, and most are represented by parts of the skeleton that overlap at least partially with those known in Gandititan. The authors provide preliminary comparisons between these taxa and Gandititan, especially to clarify the differences that exist in each case. In their work, among those species Gandititan is most similar to, it still, quote, differs from all these titanosaur forms in having caudal centra with convex anterior articular surfaces. The authors conclude that this specimen reaffirms the interpretation that, quote, titanosaurs appear to have originated in early Cretaceous, the earliest known members of the clade being Ninja Titan from the Berriasian Valanginian of Argentina. As the continents drifted farther apart during the late Cretaceous, titanosaurs formed endemic groupings around the world, including Diamantinosauria in Australia and Lognocosauria in South America, although the Saltosauridae were more widely distributed. They add that their phylogenetic mapping encouraged the interpretation of a new clade of titanosaurs that, quote, mainly inhabited eastern Asia, and suggest that titanosaurs may have been able to disperse between Asia and South America in the mid-Cretaceous. Both hypotheses will be subject to further testing as fossil evidence continues to accumulate, but Gandititan unambiguously adds to the diversity of Somphospondyli from the Cretaceous of Eastern Asia, and is, like most other Eastern Asian Somphospondyli, in falling outside lithostrotia. This indicates that the basal Somphospondyli, including early diverging titanosaurs, diversified extensively in Asia, but that the main diversification of lithostrotians may have happened elsewhere. And I'll add, who'd be shocked if that elsewhere were in South America, right? The next news article is a reanalysis of a dinosaur first described back in 1982, which has had its vertebral pneumaticities looked at more closely. The specimen is Phuwangosaurus from the Sauropoda Formation of Thailand, which is dated to the Barremian of the early Cretaceous. A series of authors in 2013 performed a CT scanning technique on cervical and dorsal vertebrae from the Phu Kum Khao locality, where more than 700 bones of several sauropod individuals were found, and compared to some of the vertebrae dubbed taxon C sauropod and also taxon B, just to keep things confusing. And they compared them to chickens. Quote, the results showed that this sauropod vertebra consisted of large, simple pneumatic chambers. Later on, in a study published in 2023, these authors described the endocast of a subadult specimen of Fuwangosaurus sirindhorne from Van Na Krai locality, the same individual used in this study. This is an example of a transitional form as sauropods were evolving from the brachiosaur shape into the titanosaurian shape, as evidenced by distinct changes and features in its vertebral characteristics. Quote, the presence of these cavities has been interpreted as an osteological trace of pneumatic diverticula, says the paper. Pneumatic diverticula are extensions of air-filled sacs that invade and hollow out bones, creating air spaces within them, which is a process called pneumatization, resulting in skeletal pneumaticity. This kind of sounds bad, but it's super useful if you're a bird, and air sacs in your bones keep you light and capable of flying. In huge sauropods, it's also useful because you can reduce your bone mass and possibly be a bit lighter on your joints when you're a titanic sauropod. The authors continue, the presence of a bird-like air sac system allows their bodies to enlarge and simultaneously reduce their skeletal density. The avian-style lung and air sacs in sauropods comprise a very efficient respiratory system. Despite the discovery of numerous Mesozoic vertebrate fossils, pneumatic structures in sauropod cervical vertebrae from Southeast Asia remain poorly understood. Now, 3 more articles about European titanosaurs, beginning with New Sauropod dinosaur from the Lower Cretaceous of Morella, Spain, provides new insights on the evolutionary history of Iberian Somphospondyli titanosauriforms, published in the Zoological Journal of the Linnaean Society in May 2024. The authors named a new Somphospondyli sauropod Garumba titan morellensis, where Garumba refers to Mola de la Garumba, one of the highest peaks in the region, and Titan, which is Greek for giant, and Morellensis, Latin for from the Morella Formation, making this the Garumba giant from Morella, with the highest peak of the mountain range lending some sense of the size of this sauropod in its name. The partial skeletons of 3 individuals, the most complete of which includes much of the vertebral column and hind limbs, were discovered and reported on. It was closely related to brachiosaurids and titanosaurs, falling in that strange Somphospondylan range of dinosaurs in the early Cretaceous. The hind foot of Garumba titan is exceptionally known and exhibits a unique combination of features among sauropods, including the loss of one of the ankle bones, the middle 3 metatarsals, which are the long bones of the foot, being especially slender, and the claw and its 3rd toe being reduced in size. Quote, the morphology of the femur suggests that Garumba titan morellensis is a putative producer of wide-gauge tracks, which are well represented by some fossil track sites in the Lower Cretaceous of Spain and Portugal. The tarsus and pes of Garumba titan morellensis are characterized by a unique combination of features, highlighting the absence of the calcaneum, the relative slenderness of the metatarsals 2, 3, and 4, with the retraction of the metatarsals 1 and 5, the presence of 3 pedal phalanges in the digit 4, and the reduction of the ungual of the digit 3. The pes morphology of Garumba titan morellensis is unique within Somphospondyli. And this discovery helps to further inform the data collection on how titanosaurs were moving around the world in their faunal exchanges, because evidently sauropods were getting all around the world. The authors discuss all kinds of dispersal ideas, but most germane to this article, a dispersal route between Europe and Asia and East Asia during the early Cretaceous, quote, seems to be supported by the close relationship of some Iberian forms with some non-titanosaurian Somphospondylians of East Asia. Of course, the authors don't pretend to have any final say on the subject. Quote, new discoveries will be necessary to understand the evolutionary history of the sauropod faunas in the Barremian-Aptian sequence in the Maastrat Basin. Looking to contribute to that Barremian to Albanian sequence in European titanosaur story, the next article reviewed a tremendous amount of material that has been accumulated over the years, and by so doing they were able to make a more informed observation on the state of titanosaurs in this ancient archipelago. Published in the Journal of Systematic Paleontology in February 2025, the article Revision of Romanian Sauropod Dinosaurs reveals high titanosaur diversity and body size disparity on the latest Cretaceous Haţeg Island, with implications for titanosaurian biogeography. Quote, since the first late Cretaceous titanosaurian sauropod dinosaur remains were found in Transylvania, and especially in the Haţeg Basin, towards the end of the 19th century, an extensive number of new sites, isolated specimens, and partial skeletons have been found and described, greatly advancing our understanding of these faunas. However, a detailed study of these sites and skeletal remains as a whole has never been carried out, with a number of taxonomic problems preventing any understanding of the diversity and phylogenetic affinities of the Haţeg Basin titanosaurs. The Haţeg Basin was an islandic area during the Late Cretaceous when much of Europe was submerged by a shallow sea, splitting the continent into a series of smaller landmasses, which is exciting for macroevolutionary paleontologists because it's an opportunity to research how animals evolved under island conditions. And the titanosaur remains show dwarf-sized and large-sized results of the limited islandic resources. Sometimes when ecological resources are smaller, a species will shrink to adapt to its environment, thus requiring fewer resources, which has been described as island dwarfism, and it's a feature observed in the titanosaurs of the Haţeg Basin. And I guess there's a more technical term, sometimes they call it island nanism. The authors performed a systematic revision of all the materials spanning from papers more than 100 years ago and cited over 100 individual fossils from more than 20 localities containing multiple elements to create the overview by which they made their assessments. Quote, following our systematic revision, we now recognize a minimum of 4 titanosaurian taxa: Magyarosaurus dacus, Paludititan nalatzensis, Petrus-Titan hungaricus, and Uriashkadici. This diversity was likely even higher, as evidenced by the substantial amount of associated material that cannot currently be adequately diagnosed as a new taxon, and yet display differences from these 4 taxa. Phylogenetically, analyses show that, quote, these Transylvanian titanosaurs present particularly close relationships with Gondwanan taxa. Magyarosaurus is recovered either as a member of close relatives of the Saltosauridae. Paludititan has affinities with Lochnosauria, along with the approximately contemporaneous Spanish titanosaur Leucotitan. Petrus-Titan is more closely related to the South American early diverging Eutitanosaurian taxa, and Uriash shares one feature uniquely with Gondwanan titanosaurs. These analyses also strengthen the paleogeographical hypothesis that the latest Cretaceous European titanosaurs were members of the Gondwanan lineages that invaded the former area during the Barremian Albion. Since its initial discovery, Magyarosaurus dacus has been identified as a dwarfed sauropod, with island dwarfism proposed as an explanation for the diminutive size of this species and other dinosaurs on Haţeg Island, whereas Paludititan and Petrus-Titan are also small-bodied sauropods, and Uriash is an order of magnitude heavier and represents one of the largest titanosaurian taxa found in the Late Cretaceous of Europe. Quote, we interpret the presence of this body size disparity as either evidence that large-bodied taxa were ecologically excluded from body size reduction by competition from small-bodied titanosaurs, or that dwarfing occurred stratigraphically earlier among several lineages, and the small-bodied titanosaurs on Haţeg Island are the descendants of existing dwarfed ancestors. Petrus-Titan hungaricus is a new species erected upon fossils perhaps uncovered in the 1930s, which through this review were discovered to be unique species. The name refers to the San Petru Formation from which they were discovered, and Titan refers to it being a titanosaur, and hungaricus means they're from Hungary. Despite being a titanosaur, it's estimated to be approximately 10 feet in length, making this obviously one of the dwarfs. Uriashkadici is a new species erected upon fossils perhaps uncovered around 1914, which is also found to be a new species. The name refers to it being a giant, as Urias means giant in Romanian folklore, and Kadic honors Hungarian geologist Ottokar Kadic. It was much bigger at about 35 feet long. The holotype specimens were housed at the collection of the Supervisory Authority of Regulatory Affairs, formerly the Geological Institute of Hungary, and they were uncovered from the Dinosaurs Lately Formation. It's comprised of 4 tail vertebrae, the right humerus, thigh bones, and left first metatarsal. The authors say finding this phylogenetic diversity, quote, strengthens the hypothesis that latest Cretaceous European titanosaurs belong to Gondwanan lineages that invaded the former area during the Barremian Albanian. We interpret the presence of body size disparity as either evidence that large-bodied taxa were ecologically excluded from body size reduction by competition with small-bodied titanosaurs, or that dwarfing occurred stratigraphically earlier among several lineages, and the small-bodied titanosaurs on Haţeg Island are the descendants of existing dwarfed ancestors. They conclude, we can find no indication of a body size-related titanosaurian turnover in the uppermost Cretaceous of the Transylvanian area. But you can see from the latest series of articles, as titanosaurs pop up all over the world, and their unique phylogenetic differences keep showing up all over the world, that it's continuing to be a challenge to build a convincing or well-supported narrative on how these animals came and went throughout the late Cretaceous. They just continued to do it. The next article is more titanosaur remains, this time from Serbia. In the article, First Dinosaurian Remains from Serbia, Sauropod and Theropod Material from the Uppermost Cretaceous of Osmakovo, published in December 2025 in the journal Cretaceous Research. The titular specimen is a fragmentary left ulna of an indeterminate sauropod from the Maastrichtian Age rock formation of Osmakovo in southeastern Serbia. The scrappy fossil is labeled NHMBEOSM 0571, housed at the Natural History Museum of Belgrade. How do they know it was a titanosaur? Quote, given the incomplete nature of the material, it is difficult to determine the affinities of the specimen, although its late Cretaceous age would be consistent with titanosaurian affinities. Recall, titanosaurs are the only surviving sauropods in the late Cretaceous, so it's got to be a titanosaur. It's a, quote, partially yet relatively undistorted left ulna with a damaged proximal end and a missing distal end, and worse yet, it, quote, was recovered as 3 separate pieces, which were glued back together. It's busted up and hardly diagnostic at a species level, but, quote, nevertheless, their broken bases suggest that they were separated by an angle of almost 90 degrees, as occurs in some non-Neosauropods and titanosauriforms, including the coeval Romanian taxon Magyarosaurus. And remember, we know it's got to be a titanosaur, so it's underwhelming, but that doesn't mean it's not the very first of its kind. The premier titanosaur remains of Serbia. The ulna is considered small, but it's hard to tell if this is a dwarf species or just a juvenile. You might think, what on earth can this chunk of fossil really offer to the greater scheme of things? And the authors say, quote, preliminary analyses suggest that Osmakovo shares similarities with the uppermost Cretaceous sites in Romania, indicating that these assemblages may be synchronous despite slight differences in habitat or depositional conditions. Moreover, the vertebrate fossil record of Osmakovo indicates the existence of an emergent landmass during the Maastrichtian, which supported freshwater sedimentation and highlights the potential for further Mesozoic vertebrate discoveries in Serbia. So it's possible that this Osmakovo locality may share similarities with other known Romanian, Hungarian, and Bulgarian localities in the Maastrichtian, and expands the already broad realm of titanosaurs in the latest Cretaceous just a little bit further. Speaking of the broad realm of titanosaurs, we've covered South America, Asia, and Europe. A new paper came out in the Journal of Evolutionary Science in April 2024 called Reappraisal of Sauropod Dinosaur Diversity in the Upper Cretaceous Winton Formation of Queensland, Australia, through 3D digitization and description of new specimens. Using 3D digital models, the authors compared anatomical characters across Australian titanosaur specimens spanning from Australotitan, Diamantinosaurus, Savannosaurus, and Wintinotitan, but they confess, quote, unfortunately, the classification of the majority of these specimens to species level has historically been impeded by their incompleteness. The hope was that with all these materials collected over the past 100 years, with digital tools, they could make a more informed analysis, even with incomplete materials. The opportunity to do more with digital tools was aided by, quote, the discovery and description of several partial skeletons from the Cenomanian Lower Turonian Winton Formation in central Queensland, with 4 species erected. The first 3, Australotitan, Diamantinosaurus, and Savannosaurus, were considered early diverging titanosaurs called Diamantinosaurs, whereas Wintinotitan was a non-titanosaurian Somphospondyli. The 3D scanning digitized the specimens, quote, facilitating enhanced comparison between type and referred specimens and heretofore undescribed specimens. And the results? Quote, supported by a specimen-level phylogenetic analysis, we suggested that Australotitan cooperensis is probably a junior synonym of Diamantinosaurus matildae, but conservatively regarded herein as an indeterminate Diamantinosaurian, meaning that the Winton Formation sauropod fauna now comprises 3, rather than 4, valid Diamantinosaurian species, Diamantinosaurus matildae, Savannosaurus aleatorum, and Wintinotitan wattsi, with the latter robustly supported as a member of the clade for the first time. Recall, Wintinotitan was considered a Somphospondyli before. Our newly presented anatomical data and critical reappraisal of the Winton Formation sauropods facilitates a more comprehensive understanding of the mid-Cretaceous sauropod paleobiota of central Queensland. The Winton Formation has, quote, produced more evidence of sauropod dinosaurs than any other stratigraphic unit on the Australian continent, say the authors, adding, quote, of these, 2 specimens are assigned to Diamantinosaurus matildae, 2 to Savannosaurus aleatorum, 3 to Wintinotitan wattsi, and 5 are retained in open nomenclature as Diamantinosauria inserte cetus. The authors, quote, conservatively regard Australotitan cooperensis as an indeterminate Diamantinosaurian owing to a lack of autapomorphies that distinguish it as a valid taxon, but suggest that it is probably a junior synonym of Diamantinosaurus matildae. The validity of Savannosaurus as a separate genus from Diamantinosaurus is upheld. Wintinotitan is robustly recovered as a member of Diamantinosauria for the first time, although its stability as a valid genus requires further clarification. Discovery of additional sauropod material from the Winton Formation will help to resolve the taxonomic classification of specimens within Diamantinosauria and shed further light on the anatomy and phylogenetic relationships of Diamantinosauria. You can see that with so much titanosaur material that larger studies and bigger questions are being asked, which can be demanding when you're just looking at scrappy pieces of busted up fossils, but with more fossils, the bigger the questions, like questions about eating. Published in January 2025 in the journal Papers in Paleontology, the article New Sauropod Teeth from the Upper Jurassic of Portugal and Their Implications for Sauropod Dental Evolution described a series of new teeth. The article says, quote, the Upper Jurassic of Portugal is well known for its dinosaurian fauna, which includes 5 sauropod species. Although only one of these species preserves associated dental material, isolated sauropod teeth are commonly found in the Upper Jurassic units of Portugal. The morphological diversity of Portuguese sauropod teeth has already been described and attributed to 4 dental morphotypes. Here we report on an additional 24 heart-shaped teeth, 9 spatulate teeth, 16 compressed chisel-shaped teeth, and 10 pencil-shaped teeth of the hitherto unstudied collection of Museo de Lorena. The heart-shaped teeth, the authors say, are attributed to Turiasaurians, the spatulate teeth to Camarasaurids, the chisel-shaped teeth to Titanosauriforms, and the pencil-shaped teeth to Flagellocauditans. Flagellocauditans is a word you don't hear people say out loud very much. This reassessment shows, quote, a general trend of increasing tooth slenderness in all studied taxonomic groups and a disappearance of broad crown taxa with well-developed tooth-to-tooth occlusion by the end of the early Cretaceous. We suggest that this may be correlated with the evolution of dental batteries in ornithischians, which are more efficient in oral food processing. Why would these slender teeth be correlated with the dental batteries in ornithischians? I've always envisioned the slender teeth to be like the spines on a rake, and basically a sauropod rakes the leaves off of plants to basically pick up and put in a leaf bag. But in a sauropod's case, the leaf bag is just down the chute and into the stomach. And they didn't chew, but rather swallowed gizzard stones and kept a shrubbery down in its digestive system for as long as it took to extract all of the nutrients necessary to be the largest terrestrial animals to ever live. They weren't chewing their food with these types of teeth. Ornithischians, with their dental batteries, on the other hand, were a completely different style of food processing. The dental batteries were jammed with teeth that occluded, which basically means that they smashed together to pulverize food before swallowing. When they argue that there was niche partitioning, these tooth shapes help make those arguments, because these different types of teeth provide entirely different functions and must be performing those functions on different types of vegetation. And this would argue why you can have multiple types of massive sauropods coexisting. They each have different shaped teeth, chisel-like, spatulate, spoon-like, and heart-shaped. There was a niche partitioning among the big sauropods too. That's what studies about these teeth are telling us. And we could look at the other end of the dietary process for answers too. This article is, frankly, it's got some interesting bits. Maybe it's related to titanosaurs, we'll see. The Journal of Cretaceous Research published in August 2025 the article Paleo-Environmental and Paleo-Ecological Inferences from the Inclusions in Vertebrate Omnivore Coprolites from the Upper Cretaceous Lameta Formation of Central India. This article investigated 50 Type A coprolites from the Lameta Formation in India, including specimens characterized by their large size and specific features associated with reptile producers. The authors say the coprolites were randomly broken into minute fragments, macerated for 3 to 4 hours with 10% concentrated H2O2 and hydrochloric acid, and then sieved through mesh apertures of 200, 500, and 1,000 micrometers. This revealed a variety of fossils in the remaining macerated material, which were examined using JEOL-JSM 25S scanning electron microscope at the Punjab University SEM laboratory in Chandigarh. They investigated a series of coprolites and found the remains of fungi, crustaceans, pollen, plants, insects, and more, but many of the type A morphotypes, which were considered to be herbivorous, were assumed to be from herbivores because, quote, the discovery of plant remnants and related sauropod bones, which led to the coprolites' attribution to sauropods. The coprolites' size, 100 millimeters, and profusion of plant contents are consistent with what one would anticipate from large herbivores, but the fecal masses are still somewhat small relative to 15-ton Isosaurus dinosaurs. The authors say it's possible that a 15-ton titanosaur might expel their waste in pellets rather than larger volumes, but they admit the 100-millimeter spores are smaller than they would imagine. Quote, moreover, the recent discovery that the coprolites are phosphatic raises the idea that the organisms that produced the coprolite were omnivores that consume both plant and animal matter. The authors had gone into the study believing that they were looking at sauropod scat, but, quote, These observations cast doubt on the conventional wisdom and raise the possibility that fecal production in this area was not due to huge herbivores like sauropods. It is challenging to build the case that unknown species produced the ancient feces without finding new taxa. The discovery does, however, suggest that re-evaluation of the paleobiology of the coprolites is warranted. It is difficult to identify the animals that produced the type A Pizdura coprolites in the absence of other fossil evidence. Nonetheless, likely fecal producers could be, they suggest, probably turtles. Given the size and phosphoric content of the type A coprolites, the authors believe that these are the remains of an omnivore, quote, even though the traditional attribute of type A coprolites, the sauropods, has been based on the coprolite plant contents and associated sauropod bones. Quote, the omnivorous interpretation is consistent with the evidence that the fecal producers ingested both plants and microbiota. This new interpretation calls into question the long-held belief that herbivorous sauropods were the only creatures that produced the feces that became the type A coprolites, but it also emphasizes the necessity of more research on these unusual coprolites. They're ruling out the idea that perhaps sauropods were ingesting microbiota through their slender teeth to complement their herbivorous diets. They don't appear to be thinking that sauropods were like baleen whales and filter-feeding critters out of the swamps and taking up insects and fishes and crustaceans. But that would be wild if that was going on. But nobody thinks so. The authors don't encourage an interpretation of an omnivorous titanosaurs. They were flatly skeptical about that, and basically we're saying the sauropod interpretation of the coprolites is now in question. This next article will help shed some light on sauropod diets. From the journal Current Biology in June 2025, the article Fossilized Gut Contents Elucidate the Feeding Habits of Sauropod Dinosaurs takes a look at gut contents of Diamantinosaurus, the guy from Australia. You recall we just had 3 Diamantinosaurs from the Neuquén Formation in an earlier article, which included Savannosaurus and Diamantinosaurus and a series of other specimens which were believed to be some type of Diamantinosaurus as well. These are the big Australian species from around the earlier Late Cretaceous of the Cenomanian. This was back before the diplodocids had died off, remember. Quote, since the discovery of the first near-complete skeletons in the late 19th century, sauropods have been almost universally interpreted as herbivorous. However, our concept of their diet is based on indirect evidence and inference, since no sauropod fossilized gut contents, called cololites, are known. Here we describe a cololite associated with a specimen of the sauropod Diamantinosaurus matilde from the mid-Cretaceous, Neuquén Formation of Queensland, Australia. Cololite is like, you can think of your colon and light as a suffix for rocks, so it's a rock that is made of the stuff from your colon. It's similar to a coprolite, where copros means excrement, and it's funny, they've got 2 different terms, but frankly, they're just what? They were created from contents that were about 2 hours apart in the digestive course of things. But anyhow, quote, the cololite is hosted within an indurated rock layer, localized in the abdominal region, and closely and consistently associated with a layer of mineralized skin. Conifer pinnules, angiosperm leaves, and seed fern fruiting bodies are preserved within, as are chemical biomarkers consistent with the gymnosperms and angiosperms, say the authors. Quote, this Diamantinosaurus cololite provides the first direct empirical evidence in sauropods of herbivory, demonstrating generalist feeding, low to high level browsing, and minimal oral processing of food. The observation of, quote, minimal processing in the cololite reinforces the interpretation that titanosaurs were just raking up and swallowing plant material and sending it right down the hatch, no chewing necessary. The generalist feeding is a bit different from what has been argued before when we were reading about the spoon, heart, spatulate, and chisel-like tooth shapes, which suggested specialist feeding behaviors and niche partitioning. But in that article, the titanosauriforms were said to have chisel-shaped teeth, whereas the chimerasaurids were spatulate, the flagellicaudats were pencil-shaped, and the pterosaurians were heart-shaped. The authors described the feeding apparatus of Diamantinosaurus thusly, quote, the snout of Diamantinosaurus is rounded, as in the taxa like Giraffatitan branchi, but in contrast to taxa like Nigersaurus, taxeti, with squared-off snouts. Whereas squared-off snouts have been associated with specialist low-level browsing, rounded snouts have been associated with higher-level feeding. The tooth row of Diamantinosaurus extends almost as far back as the anterior margin of the interorbital fenestra. This contrasts with the teeth of several other sauropod taxa, including diplodocoids and some titanosaurs, which are restricted to the interior region of the snout. Less extensive tooth rows have been linked with low-level browsing and are often but not always correlated with squared-off snouts. The teeth of Diamantinosaurus are large and relatively robust and were probably replaced slowly, given that only 2 replacement teeth were present per alveolus. At the other extreme, some sauropods like Nigersaurus had small, relatively gracile teeth that were replaced rapidly, with up to 7 replacement teeth per alveolus. Tooth microwear analysis of Diamantinosaurian teeth has revealed little evidence of tooth substrate contact in the form of pits and gouges. This contrasts with the diplodocoids and narrow-crowned toothed titanosaurs, wherein pits and gouges are quite common. Pits and gouges are interpreted as evidence of tooth grit or tooth soil contact and linked to low-level browsing. So Diamantinosaurus ate more like a brachiosaur than a diplodocid, which phylogenetically isn't surprising, as they're interpreted as being more closely related to brachiosaurs than to diplodocids. The paper continues, the concentration of plants within the lower gut contents layer is far greater than seen elsewhere at the Diamantinosaurus site. Furthermore, the plant fragments within the gut contents layer are broadly uniform in size and represent a substantially less diverse flora than is evident elsewhere in the site. Several of the plant specimens in the gut contents layer are broken or frayed, which is consistent with them having been sheared by the sauropod and consistent with the hypothesis that the sauropod food acquisition involved limited mastication. The authors suggest that the food was not chewed, and so the sauropod was, quote, relying instead on fermentation and their gut microflora for digestion. The variety of plants in the cololite, which was conifer foliage and bracts, seed fern fruiting bodies, angiosperm leaves, implies that Diamantinosaurus was an indiscriminate bulk feeder, at least once it was a subadult. The longevity of the clade Sauropoda was underpinned by the persistence through time of generalist feeders like Diamantinosaurus that were capable of feeding at a range of heights on a variety of different plant species. These cololites and coprolites help shed light on interesting questions about dinosaur behavior that can't quite be answered by the bones alone. And of course, ichnofossils like trackways can help reveal more interesting behaviors too. In a July 2025 article published in the Zoological Journal of the Linnean Society entitled Remarkable Soft Tissue Anatomy Recorded in Titanosaur Tracks from the Latest Cretaceous of Mongolia, the authors report on a collection of well-preserved natural track casts made by sauropods from the Nemegt locality of the Late Cretaceous in southern Mongolia. The tracks preserve, quote, exceptional details of the soft tissues, including the ungual and fleshy cuticle of pedal digits 1 and 2, regional changes in scale size across the pes, and peculiar spur-like scales on the lateral, posterior, and palmar surfaces of the mani. The tracks show, quote, that the large pedal unguals were largely encased in squamous soft tissues, and that only a small portion of the claw protruded beyond the cuticle. These findings imply that the pedal digit range of motion would have been reduced compared to traditional bone-on-bone estimates, although scratch digging remains a tenable hypothesis for pedal digit function. Fleshy pads on the pes and spur-like scales on the manus may have been adaptations to deal with the sandy substrates of the Nemegt ecosystem, although other explanations cannot be excluded. The article reveals sauropod tracks are common and abundant at the Nemegt locality, especially in the Barangayat Formation, which is overlain by the Nemegt Formation, and the sediments create natural casts. Quote, sauropod body fossils, however, are uncommon and are restricted to only 2 lithostrotian titanosaurid genera, both of which come from the Nemegt Formation, Nemegtosaurus mongoliensis, which was named on the basis of a well-preserved skull, and Opistocolicadia szarzynski, the holotype of which is a nearly complete postcranial skeleton lacking the cervical series and skull. No sauropod body fossils have been recovered from the Barangayat Formation despite decades of intensive sampling, and there are some researchers who encourage that these 2 titanosaurs may be conspecific, or of the same species. Note, Opistocolicadia is my go-to name for hilariously obtuse animal species. It looks ridiculous when you see the word. It sounds unrepeatable, and it literally describes details on a vertebra, but not in like a cute Hunchback of Notre Dame sort of way, but in the hollow-tailed back of Wojtek Szarzynski sort of way, making it sound like a much less popular Gothic novel by Victor Hugo. But that's entirely beside the point. What's important is, quote, virtually nothing is known of their soft tissue anatomy except for scale impressions associated with footprints. So, what do the tracks suggest? A general sauropod foot is composed of 5 robust metatarsals with phalanges restricted to the first 4 digits and ungual claws on only the first 3 digits, and Opistocolicadia, the only fossil Nemegt sauropod foot yet known, conforms to this pattern. The tracks are circular to elliptical in outline with up to 5 anterolaterally directed digits that show that the foot was enshrouded with, quote, epidermal scales that vary considerably in size, where the scales are generally smallest around the digits, and increase in size posteriorly along the medial and lateral edges of the track, with the largest scales along the heel. Quote, the most remarkable feature of the pes is the cuticle, marking the boundary between the keratinous covering on the ungule and the surrounding fleshy part of digits 1 and 2. The digit was largely enclosed in flesh that appears greatly inflated relative to the ungule, of which only a small part is exposed. The toe claws on Opisthocolocaudia and Nemegtosaurus are long, up to 15 centimeters and 19 centimeters respectively, and are gently curved and mediolaterally compressed. The footprints reveal that only a, quote, small part of the ungule was exposed beyond the cuticle. They estimate only 10 to 13% of the total length of the ungule was actually exposed. The fun part of this study is discussing parts of the ichthofossil which doesn't have a correlative to the skeleton. The hands of the mech sauropods were, quote, enveloped in protrusive epidermal scales, or spurs. These spurs deviate markedly from the more flattened scales found on the feet and bodies of other sauropods, and are also unique among the epidermal scales reported in other non-avian dinosaurs. The authors say that spurs sort of resemble what you might see on a burrowing tortoise. The authors conclude, while we cannot definitively pinpoint the purpose of the manual integumentary spurs, we propose 3 possible functions: intra- and or intraspecific defense, scratch digging, possibly for water or nutrients, and traction in sandy substrates. While none of these possible functions are mutually exclusive, we find scratch digging and traction the most likely explanation. Whichever functional hypothesis or hypotheses proves correct, these spurs provide a rare glimpse into how sauropods interacted with their environment. If these spurs are functionally associated with a desert environment, they illustrate environmental adaptations unlike any previously documented among dinosaurs or any extant analog. These discoveries further emphasize the paleobiological significance of the Nemegt locality, which is regarded as one of the most important sites worldwide for the study of Cretaceous terrestrial ecosystems. All right, the final article is called Sauropod Nesting Sites on Mid-Channel Bars, Taphonomic Evidence of Environmental Adaptation in Lower Cretaceous Sihwa Formation in Korea, published in the journal Paleogeography, Paleoclimatology, Paleoecology in October 2025. The pre-published article is available online. This nesting site contrasts the observation that nesting was done on placid floodplains. The authors report on the Gojiangri sauropod nesting area from the Sihwa Formation of the Lower Cretaceous, which captures sauropod reproduction within a, quote, high-energy braided river system. They documented 196 eggs on more than 25 horizons, observing 4 eutaxa, or 4 specific types of eggs, of which about 175 of them are attributable to sauropods. They found that, quote, 32% of the eggs were from elevated mid-channel bars, indicating a nesting strategy that sought sun-warmed, predator-deterring high ground encircled by water-filled channels acting as natural moats, while accepting the attendant flood risk. They believe, quote, sauropods intentionally chose elevated bar surfaces rather than randomly nesting across a braided river system, taking advantage of their high topography and surrounding channels as a natural moat against predators. Modern river nesting birds likewise exploit sand or gravel bars to reduce terrestrial predation, while the giant Amazon river turtle relies on high portions of bar to minimize flood risks. They imagine that, like those birds, quote, the timing of breeding is often aligned so that the food is abundant when chicks hatch. If sauropods also synchronize breeding with resource highs, example in the early summer, ephemeral braided systems would still be flowing during nesting period, creating a natural moat around the mid-channel bar nests. The idea would be the sauropods would take the defensive benefits and potentially offer increased sunlight exposure and favorable thermal conditions at the risk of episodic mass washouts. Quote, altogether, Gojiangri evidence broadens our picture of sauropod reproduction. Low-energy floodplains were not their inevitable nesting ground. When relief, sediment supply, and flood rhythm aligned, these dinosaurs moved onto bar tops within active braided channels, sites that offered solar warmth and a water barrier against predators, even as they increased flood exposure. This choice underscores the behavioral flexibility that allowed giant herbivores to flourish amid the highly dynamic landscapes of the early Cretaceous. So, titanosaurs are huge. They've got huge bones, and they obviously dominated their paleo environments, which means their fossils are noticeable and abundant. Their conspicuous size and abundance contribute to why they're more readily discovered, and their apparent diversity and derived traits make them highly diagnostic as new species, which is why we've got about 6 South American species, 2 Asian species, 3 European species, and more from Australia in this episode. And because of their abundant remains, paleontologists have greater access to a lot of material, which is why we get a lot of articles that explore more about their relationships and interactions in the environment. Hence, another series of articles about their dietary habits, trackways, and nesting sites too. But we got through all of it, and I hope it helps you feel like you're more caught up on what's being published on Macronarians lately. Thanks for tuning in to Dinosaurs Lately. If you'd like to find links to the materials discussed on today's show, you can visit dinosaurslately.blogspot.com, which is a companion piece to the Dinosaurs Lately podcast. Dinosaurs Lately is a companion show to the Jurassic Parkcast, the podcast where guests chat with me about Michael Crichton's 1990 novel Jurassic Park, and also Not That Too. And if you'd like to be a guest on that show, you can reach me at ryansrogers@gmail.com. These podcasts are part of the Spring Chickens banner of amateur intellectual properties, including the Spring Chickens Funny Pages, the Tomb of the Undead graphic novel, the Second Lapse graphic novelettes, The Infantry, and the worst of them all, the King Street Capers. And you can find links to all that baggage in the show notes or by visiting the schickens.blogspot.com. And you can connect to and follow on Facebook at facebook.com/springchickencapers, on YouTube by searching for the Jurassic Parkcast podcast, on Tumblr at Mr. Rogers22, on X at RogersRyan22, on Blue Sky at RogersRyan22.bsky.social. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you feel that you're now all caught up on Macronarians for now. Until next time.